Waterfowl Tomorrow, Chapter Mississippi Flyway, page 197. Canada geese are produced in Canada, mostly in Ontario, except one fairly large nesting group at Seney National Wildlife Refuge in Michigan, and a few smaller colonies scattered elsewhere through the Flyway. A few appear in early September. Peak populations reach northern states by late October or early November. They reach mid-Flyway states by late November, where most of them spend the winter. These geese, more than any other waterfowl, respond readily to management of habitat. Horicon National Wildlife Refuge, for example, started from scratch and built up a fall population exceeding 100,000 in less than 20 years. Other developments, notably Union County and Horseshoe Lake State Refuges and Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge in southern Illinois and Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri, gained sharply in numbers at the same time that the southern states were reporting a drastic decline. The implication was that the birds were shortstopped by attractive habitat developments. Now I'm going to talk about the Louisiana Commission meeting for LDWF that was held on December the 6th, 1971 at 9:30 in the morning. It was a special board meeting, and they were speaking about this exact same thing, about the Canada goose being short-stopped. But this is exactly where I talked to y'all about the special thing was about this meeting where they were talking about the snow and the blue geese being short-stopped. So I'll start right here. Prior to getting into that, at the commission meeting last week, the commission instructed Mr. Yancey and his staff to make a tour by plane of the Mississippi Valley area up into Kansas to get an eyeball look at what is happening to our geese and the other migratory waterfowl. Mr. Yancey has returned from that trip, and I would like for him at this time to give us a report on what he found. Mr. Yancey. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, for the past 2 or 3 years, we have been vitally concerned with the fact that increasing numbers of blue and snow geese are being short-stopped on state and federal waterfowl refuges in the Missouri Valley. Now, we all know that the wintering flock of blue and snow geese on the Gulf Coast annually amounts to about 1 million birds. And our blue geese that winter here in coastal Louisiana number around 400 to 500,000 birds each winter. And these birds migrate into Louisiana during the last half of October. But in recent years, we have noted that these birds are coming later, on up into December, and in fewer numbers, and we are very much concerned with the fact that there is now a definite possibility that eventually the blue and snow geese will winter in the Midwest rather than the Gulf Coast. Of course, this is going to adversely affect hunting in Louisiana, and certainly the blue and the snow geese are an important part of wildlife scene in our coastal marshes. And to be without these birds is going to create somewhat of a disastrous situation insofar as Louisiana is concerned. Following last Tuesday's meeting of the Commission, we made an aerial inspection of these state and federal refuges, principally in Missouri and Iowa, and over into Illinois. And we found that some 400,000 blue and snow geese, or around 40% of the Gulf Coast flock, are still in the Midwest when normally they should be in the Gulf Coast marshes. It appears that the trend of short-stopping activity insofar as the blue and snow geese has further increased over the last year to the extent of about 20%. So we are fearful that this is a trend is continuing to develop. It is increasing in scope, and ultimately we feel that unless some drastic steps are taken in that region, that our Gulf Coast marshes are going to be without blue and snow geese. While we were up there, we also looked over the refuges that are now accommodating the Canada goose that formerly wintered here in Louisiana. And I think we all know that at one time Louisiana wintered probably around 200,000 Canada geese. And now we winter less than 1,000. As a result of the fact that that population of birds has been shortstopped very effectively in the Midwest on Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge in central Missouri, we found about 180,000 Canada geese. Of course, over in Horseshoe Lake in southern Illinois, there were another 40 or 50 or 60,000 Canadas. It looks like the same thing is happening with the blue and snow geese that has already happened with the Canada geese. Certainly, we do not feel that this is in the interest of the biology of the bird to drastically change the wintering ground areas of those birds. What it actually amounts to is a tremendous overconcentration of blue and snow geese on very limited sanctuary areas. You have some very small refuges up there, whereas our refuges run 40 to 140,000 acres. Theirs run from a few hundred acres up in size, up to 6 or 7,000 acres in size. To overconcentrate large numbers of geese in limited areas like that, we feel opens the door to the possibility of disease and parasites, which could very quickly decimate the populations of those birds. Of course, fowl cholera is something that can happen to blue and snow geese, so we are fearful that this is certainly not in the best interest of maintaining the populations of geese in this flyway. We have asked that some steps be taken to stop this, and I think some steps have been taken. But it appears from what we saw up there Thursday and Friday that those steps were ineffective and that the trend in short stopping of blue and snow geese has further increased over the last year. As I recall, last year when Senator Ellender made an inquiry to the Secretary of the Interior, he more or less got in writing a commitment from them that they would no longer engage in that type of activity. I think we should certainly make a report to Senator Ellender's office. Now, alright, so I talked about the 1985 Farm Bill in the video, and then I referenced the loophole in the Migratory Bird Treaty in 1986. So, I'm now going to go to the Migratory Bird Treaty reform, and I'm going to point out some of the history because the reform talks about everything in it, and it tells you exactly what happened with this treaty. In 1985, the Sixth Circuit held in United States versus Wolf 758 F 2D 1121 that strict liability felony crimes under the MBTA relating to the sale of migratory bird parts violated due process rights of the defendant. In response, Congress added the scientific requirement for felony offenses under the MBTA and expressly reinforced the strict liability standard for misdemeanors, which included baiting-related offenses. In 1991, amid much criticism that the migratory bird hunting regulations were outdated and difficult to understand, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the service, published a notice stated its intent to revise the regulations. In 1997, the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies formed a committee to study the regulations. This committee made several recommendations to the service, including a change in the standard from strict liability to knowledge for baiting offenses. In March of 1998, the service published a proposed rule making numerous changes to the regulations relating to agricultural practices and moist soil management to clarify and simplify the baiting regulations. This service did not propose to change the strict liability standard. So, whenever the Migratory Bird Treaty reform went into effect, what it was going to do, it was going to coincide with the Farm Bill. It was going to work together and be on a 5-year plan. That's the plan that the Farm Bill goes under, is every 5 years. Now, I'm going to read the Section 4 report from the Migratory Bird Treaty reform. This section mandates that the Secretary submit to Congress a report analyzing the effect of this legislation and the general practice of baiting in migratory bird conservation and law enforcement efforts under the MBTA. The report is due no later than 5 years after the date of the enactment of this bill. The purpose of the report is to provide Congress with additional information with which to consider this issue in the future. The committee held a hearing on this legislation on September the 24th, 1998, during which it was clear that other than incidental information, relatively little evidence exists to definitely support either side of the debate on the merits of this legislation. 3 general issues of debate were raised, and each should be addressed in the report. The first is whether baiting itself has significant impact on conservation of migratory birds, and specifically whether this impact can be compensated by just adjusting the bag limits and seasons. The second is whether the addition of signature requirement for baiting related offenses will affect migratory bird conservation by increasing the practice of baiting amongst hunters. The third, and most important, is whether the addition of the signature requirement will affect law enforcement efforts. In particular, the report should consider whether the new standard has hindered enforcement efforts because of the difficulties in demonstrating that a hunter knew or should have known that the area was baited. The committee intends to re-examine this issue in 5 years after this study has been completed. Okay, so in the video, I also talked about the fact that these conservation programs and partnerships with various organizations, all this is funded with United States taxpayers' dollars. Now, there's requirements and regulations to how much land you can put into unharvested crops or flooded unharvested crops or various other issues that normally would have been illegal due to the Migratory Bird Treaty. But they put loopholes in this treaty, and I'm going to reference 707 in the Migratory Bird Treaty reform, and it's talking about violations and penalties. And I'm going to point this out, that if they wasn't following the requirements, then they would be subject to imprisonment or fines or various other things. Now, the key thing is, not your average Joe or someone who is not in these programs could do these types of operations because it's not a normal agricultural practice, and they're not doing it in partnerships with various organizations and be able to do this on their property because it's against the Migratory Bird Treaty. So I'm going to reference 707, violations and penalties and forfeitures. A, except otherwise provided in this section, any person, association, partnership, or corporation who shall violate any provisions of said conventions or of this subchapter, or who shall violate or fail to comply with any regulation made pursuant to this subchapter shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and upon conviction therefore shall be fined not more than $500. 1. Shall be fined not more than $10,000 or be imprisoned not more than 6 months, or both. 2. In the case of violation of paragraph 1 or 2 of section 3B that is committed in connection with guiding, outfitting, or providing any other service offered, provided, or obtained in exchange for money or other consideration shall be fined under Title 18 United States Code in prison not more than 1 year or both. Now I'm going to go over the regulations which were made and pulled a lot of their information and wording from the original Migratory Bird Treaty. Now remember, the original Migratory Bird Treaty was written between 1916 and 1918. And I'll start with manipulation of agricultural crops. You cannot legally hunt waterfowl over manipulated agricultural crops except after the field has been subject to a normal harvest and removal of grain. Manipulation includes, but is not limited to, such activities as mowing, shredding, disking, rolling, chopping, trampling, flattening, burning, or herbicidal treatments. Now I'm going to stop right there. Herbicidal treatments in 1918 was flooding. Chemical forms of herbicidal treatments weren't even invented until 1937. So, just making that point to y'all. Grain or seed which is present as a result of manipulation that took place prior to a normal harvest is bait. For example, no hunting could legally occur on or over a field where a corn crop has been knocked down by a motorized vehicle. Kernels of corn would be exposed and or scattered. If for whatever reason an agricultural crop or a portion of an agricultural crop has not been harvested, example, equipment failure, weather, insect infestation, disease, etc., and the crop or remaining portion of the crop has been manipulated, then the area is a baited area and cannot be legally hunted for waterfowl. For example, no waterfowl hunting could legally occur on or over a field of sweet corn that has been partially harvested and the remainder mowed. Now, I'm going to jump down to hunting over natural vegetation because this was the exact spot in the regulations. Whenever I read, I knew something wasn't right. I mean, if everything I just didn't read tells you what they're doing is illegal, let me go a step further and read the hunting over natural vegetation area. Natural vegetation is any non-agricultural, native, or naturalized plant species that grows at a site in response to planting or from existing seeds or other propagules. Natural vegetation does not include planted millet because of its use as both an agricultural crop and a species of natural vegetation for moist soil management. However, planted millet that grows on its own in subsequent years is considered natural vegetation. I'm going to stop right there for a second. So they said natural vegetation does not include planted millet because of its use as both an agricultural crop. So that means if you planted millet that year, it's not considered natural vegetation. So if you flooded it, you just manipulated it. So let's keep going. If you restore and manage wetlands as a habitat for waterfowl and other migratory birds, you can manipulate the natural vegetation in these areas and make them available for hunting. Natural vegetation does not include plants grown as agricultural crops. Under no circumstances can you hunt waterfowl over manipulated crops prior to the normal harvest, nor can you hunt waterfowl over manipulated wildlife food plots or manipulated plantings for soil stabilization. Pretty interesting, huh? Now I'm going to go to the CFRs in the Migratory Bird Treaty. Excerpts from Title 50 Code of Regulations, Part 20.21. No person shall take migratory game birds by the aid of baiting or on or over any baited area where a person knows or reasonably should know that the area is or has been baited. However, nothing in this paragraph prohibits the taking of any migratory game bird, including waterfowl, coots, and cranes, on or over the following lands or areas that are not otherwise baited areas. Now, before I read this next one, all right, you have a normal harvest date for every agricultural crop known to man. They tell you in your specific state where you are. And matter of fact, they'll even go down to the counties and tell you when your harvest date is for a crop. So, let me read this. You can hunt standing crops or flooded standing crops, including aquatics, standing, flooded, or manipulated natural vegetation, flooded harvested croplands, or land or areas where seeds or grain have been scattered solely as a result of a normal agricultural planting, harvesting, and post-harvest manipulation, or normal soil stabilization practice. Why do you think that they said right here you can hunt standing or flooded standing crops? Does that mean, let's just put it into simple terms, you can hunt your corn or you can hunt your rice? You just can't manipulate it prior to the normal harvest. When did flooding become a part of a normal harvest for a non-floodable crop? Because every definition that I will read, it says that you're manipulating it, no matter what it is. Matter of fact, the NRCS requirements from the government for the CRP and WRP even says flooding is a form of manipulation. So did they forget that on the Migratory Bird Treaty and regulations? I would say that they did. Because if you flood a crop prior to the normal harvest date, because you got to remember, corn, some states, or actually a lot of states, corn is not harvested until about the first week of December a lot of times. So therefore, what they were saying in the Migratory Bird Treaty is you can hunt your cornfield. They knew that they couldn't tell a farmer he couldn't hunt his cornfield. They knew that they couldn't tell a rice farmer he couldn't hunt his rice field. But what it was saying is you can hunt your field prior to the normal harvest. You just cannot manipulate it. So if you flooded a cornfield, you just manipulated it and created a wildlife food plot with the sole intent to lure, attract, and kill migratory birds. If a rice farmer did not harvest his crop and he flooded his field back with 100% yield, he then just manipulated it and created a wildlife food plot with the sole intent to lure, attract, and kill migratory birds. Okay, now, where I had talked to you about implementing CES and pulling the power away from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, because prior to 1998, that actually is what the United States Fish and Wildlife Service was talking about in the Peer article, if you read it, and I'll end up reading some for y'all here in a minute. But what it was doing, it was giving the power of CES to govern over what was a normal agricultural practice. And if you don't believe me, we can just go right here to the definitions from Title 50 Code of Regulations, Part 20.11. Normal agricultural planting, harvesting, or post-harvest manipulation means a planting or harvest undertaken for the purpose of producing and gathering a crop, or manipulation after such harvest and removal of grain that is conducted in accordance with official recommendations of state extension specialists of the Cooperative State Research, Education, and Extension Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. Note, by policy, the service does not make the distinction between agricultural fields planted with the intent to harvest and those planted without such intent, as long as the planting is in accordance with the Cooperative Extension Service recommendations. So if all that wasn't enough for you, I've got something even better. Let's go on to the dove hunting section of the Migratory Bird Treaty, because dove hunting has a little bit more leniency to actually preparing a field, whether it be a wildlife food plot or agricultural crops, because it's so early in the season, they know for a fact you're going to have agricultural crops out there. But let's talk about it real quick. I'm going to start at manipulation of crops and other vegetation. Agricultural crops, other feed, and natural vegetation may be manipulated to improve dove hunting. Manipulation means the alteration of natural vegetation or agricultural crops by activities such as mowing, shredding, disking, rolling, chopping, trampling, flattening, burning, or herbicidal treatments. Manipulation does not include the distribution or scattering of seeds, grains, or other feed after removal from or storage on the field where grown. You should be aware that although you can hunt doves over manipulated agricultural crops, you cannot hunt waterfowl over manipulated agricultural crops except after the field has been subject to a normal harvest and removal of grain. Pretty clear, huh? Now we're going to go to the PEER document, because I was just telling you about the United States Fish and Wildlife Service being pretty upset. Matter of fact, a lot of them had their jobs being threatened. The whole PEER article will tell you about it if you just go to flywayfederationusa.com and look underneath the facts and documents section. You can pull up the whole PEER article. I'm not going to be able to read this whole thing to you because it would take up so much time, but I will read just a couple of lines off of page 5 in the PEER article, executive summary. At a time when migratory bird populations are stressed by habitat loss, pollution, and hunting, the Department of the Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service, USFWS, the federal agency mandated to conserve America's wildfowl, is proposing changes to liberalize restrictions against the use of bait to attract waterfowl. According to its own law enforcement personnel, USFWS has succumbed to mounting political pressure to loosen the federal baiting prohibition. Baiting is the illegal practice of using feed to attract game. It is a highly effective way to lure birds within a hunter's range of fire, because feeding birds conditions them to return to a specific area time and time again. In this regard, a baited area is essentially no different than a bird feeder. Law enforcement officers and ethical hunters agree that this activity, which has been outlawed since 1935, violates the tradition and sporting heritage of hunting. Despite more than 6 decades of enforcement, baiting remains one of the most common hunting violations. Baiting usually occurs in conjunction with other illegal hunting practices, such as exceeding kill or bag limits, due to the vulnerability of migratory birds to the lure of bait. Large-scale baiting usually results in the slaughter of hundreds of birds in a short period of time. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is back in Waterfowl of Tomorrow, written in 1964 by the United States Department of the Interior. Now, I just read the PEER document, and you heard me say baiting was outlawed in 1935. So all this stuff ties together. Whenever you go to looking and researching and reading all this stuff, you'll see how everything works together. No matter what study it's from, no matter if it's from United States Fish and Wildlife, to state agencies. Everyone saw this stuff happening, and it all ties together. Now, in Waterfowl Tomorrow, page 432, in the 20s, when cheap corn was available during the Depression, baiting began with a vengeance. In the Illinois bottoms near Beardstown, duck clubs were spreading as much as 7,000 bushels of corn each season on 20-acre tracts. It was estimated that 6 million bushels of corn were fed by the Illinois hunting clubs during the open season of 1933. In a sense, this was the beginning of corn in waterfowl tradition of the Mississippi Flyway, and no sooner was baiting outlawed in the mid-30s than the first of the new mechanical corn pickers came clanking on to the national scene. By sheer undeserved luck, the hunters had won again. One of the very factors that silted the oxbow lakes and overflows, the upland fields of cash corn, had helped compensate for the loss of wild food stocks of waterfowl. But if corn ever vanishes as a major food supply of ducks along the upper Mississippi Flyway, Midwestern ducks and duck hunting will suffer a grievous loss. At best, the mallards may fly almost non-stop to the southern wintering grounds and pass a half a mile high over the Corn Belt guns. Let me repeat that. Mississippi Flyway, Midwestern ducks, and duck hunting will suffer a grievous loss. At best, the mallards may fly almost non-stop to the southern wintering grounds and pass a half a mile high over the Corn Belt guns. So, they know what's keeping the birds there. They knew what was keeping the birds there in the 20s. And guess what? In the 30s, well, the government stepped in and banned baiting, and made sure that no one was leaving unharvested crops and supplemental feeding. So they knew that they needed to provide hunting opportunities to these guys so that they wouldn't be doing this baiting and people wouldn't be going to prison over this. So what they did was they started the refuge systems. I told y'all, after World War II, they provided hunting opportunities to the northern hunters. If you just read Waterfowl of Tomorrow, it will tell you the whole story. I'm begging y'all, order this book. Anything that you want to know about waterfowl is in it. Please read it. All right, so now I'm going to talk about unharvested versus harvested to finish this up. Now, this is a study that Dr. Brian Davis and Richard Kaminsky did whenever Richard Kaminsky, which is now the Illinois Natural Resources guy, and Brian Davis is with Mississippi State. This was whenever Kaminsky was with the program at Mississippi State. Now, the funny thing about these two is in the wildfowl article, both of them said that there have been no studies done on versus unharvested versus harvested. You know, that was their total argument against what I was doing. So I'm going to point this out to you. This is a study that they completed. So let's look at rice. Unharvested rice will support 29,364 ducks for 1 day on 1 acre. Harvested rice will support 131. Now, let's look at corn. Corn, unharvested, will support 25,669 ducks for 1 day on 1 acre. Harvested corn will support 970. Now, do y'all see maybe why it would be a problem if someone had, let's say, 150 acres? Or let's even think about some of these clubs in Missouri, the major ones. Whenever you're looking at 800 acres of unharvested corn just on one location, then you look at other locations, 650 acres. You're talking about a huge area that can sustain numbers of ducks that are unreal, and they don't have to leave. So now I'm going to pull up the other document. Now, this study pretty much mirror images the study that Mississippi State did. This study was done by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The numbers pretty much match up identically. So this is another study proving my point to what is going on up the flyway. Areas of standing rice and corn can support many ducks per acre. Once harvested, however, the ability of such areas to sustain numbers of ducks drops tremendously. Harvested corn is somewhere below 1,000 DUD acre, below that of even an average moist soil. It should also be noted that intensively managed moist soil areas have been shown to produce figures ranging from 11,000 to 14,000 DUD acre. In addition, researchers have found that when food densities get too low for even efficient feeding, about 45 pounds per acre, that ducks will give up on a particular location and move to new areas to feed. Thank you for your time, and I know that this took up a lot of time, and I know it's not some pretty chubby guy like me on the camera, but at least I'm showing you the actual documents and stuff that happened. So if you need any more information and facts, please feel free. FlywayFederationUSA.com. Go to the facts section. And if you agree with what we're doing and you support the cause, please buy a membership, buy a shirt, buy decals. Help me out. This isn't cheap to fight this. Thank y'all.